This week, Chase Cunningham joins me to discuss zero trust, breaches, and a lot more. Stay tuned. Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 53, being recorded on Wednesday, June 25th, 2025. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadoorian, with a short announcement before we dig into our interview today. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. With me today is Chase Cunningham, aka Dr. Zero Trust. Chase, welcome to Below the Surface.
Hey, thanks for having me. Your setup is much more interesting than mine. I'm using the rented space I could find while I'm on the road right now.
That's right. Yeah, podcasting while you're traveling is difficult. I have the luxury of being in the studio today, it's very hot because I forgot to turn the air conditioning on earlier. And so when I got in today, it was 99 degrees in my studio.
Yeah, that's
so it takes a long time to recover from that.
That's rough.
Yeah, it's warm. It's good. I'm not cold. I gotta look at it that way, right? So, Chase, give us a little bit about your background and particularly how you got the moniker or nickname or handle Dr. Zero Trust.
Sure. So I'm a retired Navy chief. I was a cryptologist for my career. Then I was at NSA for a while doing stuff there. Then I was lucky enough to get over to Forrester Research and take a bunch of their ZT stuff that John Kindervag had kind of put in play theory-wise and make it practical. And then after that, I've been consulting on my own since then. I've managed to write 11 books. Number 12 comes out next month. The Dr. Zero Trust thing actually started as a joke, and it just turned into kind of a brand. And like everything else in my life, I'm perfectly okay stumbling into, some form of success. So I wish I could say I actually thought about it, but it literally just came as a joke between some friends, and then it turned into a thing. So here we are.
Sometimes that's the best way. Sometimes they get you in trouble, but sometimes that's the best way. So
yeah, I mean, it's a if you take yourself too serious, like what's the point? Life's no fun.
This much is true. What's the state of zero trust today? I feel like zero trust was one of those things that was born out of like a Beyond Corp paper, kind of was one of the defining moments for it, and still a category today, but I don't hear it talked about as much. So give us like the state of zero trust.
Yeah, well, I think we've jumped the shark on the, market stupidity around ZT. Like we hit peak dumb with that a few years ago, which is fine. That's, markets are markets and they are defined to kind of build things up and get people interested. I was on a call last night with the folks at the DoD office that have put a couple $2 billion into ZT for the government, and it's rolling along quite well. So I think, the state of it is we're past the point of concept and theory. We've got practical implementation. We've got money going. We've got organizations internationally that are doing it. I think we're in a good spot overall. But of course, there's always, doubters and haterade and those types of things. And then there's always the conversation and question about, well, what's next? I mean, the truth of the matter is it's a strategy and you evolve your strategy over time. So, what's next is whatever you decide is next.
I feel like there are practical implementations that do work for zero trust that kind of get like not enough attention because people get hyper focused on zero trust as a buzzword. You agree? Do you agree with that? Because I wish I had looked up before the show, but there was a company that sponsored the show back in the day. Their logo had like green in it and stuff, and their founders were amazingly technical. They hired a data scientist to do some amazing things. And they got bought by Zscaler. Okay. And now that's Zscaler's product for zero trust. Now I can't even remember what the other company was. Great people to work with. But they did demos on my podcast years ago where they're like, hey, there's this Python application, it's running, and I'm going to try and do like a server-side request forgery. And it's like, look, that's completely stopped. And like had actually implemented it and shown it real in a live demo. I'm like, That's actual zero trust. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean we're at a stage now where the infrastructure side has become pretty commonplace for ZT. There's been folks in gas and electric that are doing zero trust. There's folks
Yep.
over in overseas that are talking about ZT for like the oil industry and those types of things. Saudi Arabia,
Yep.
APAC
Is
stuff.
that a lot of networking, like the networking side of zero trust and what we call micro-segmentation?
Yes, sir. That's what we're talking about there
Yeah.
is getting that down to the nuts and bolts and the infrastructure side. And I think now we're at the spot where we're starting to see like ZT for users and BYOD, which is good.
Yep.
I'm hoping that it like kills the whole phishing training thing because it's entirely possible it will. But
Hmm.
we're moving forward on that as an initiative as well.
Yeah, I think that the data center is an interesting part. I spend a good amount of time looking at BMC, baseboard management controllers, and the security around that. And one of the things we were talking about last week was if you've got IT infrastructure, right, and this is becoming a thing because people are deploying data center, like, oh, I can do AI. I need like a rack. And my joke is like, you've got those empty racks from when you moved to the cloud. Now you can fill that with AI data center stuff to
It all
train your
comes back.
models if you're into that kind of thing. But all server gear has that BMC component. And I'm like, you really need to lock it down. And I believe it ties into a zero trust principle. Like the BMCs don't need to talk to each other. So you can limit your exposure. Like if an attacker compromises one BMC, even if they are on that network, they shouldn't be able to compromise all the BMCs. And that's a zero trust principle in the design that I just described, correct?
Yeah, that's the whole thing about correct segmentation, isolation, and those types of things. I don't have it with me, but I have a really good slide I've used in the past where it shows the Titanic, which was a pretty, honestly, in today's comparison, is a small ship, but
Yeah.
the Titanic was the unsinkable ship. And then behind it, I've superimposed the modern cruise ship, and the modern cruise ship just dwarfs that thing. And the point to
Mm-hmm.
be made is modern cruise ships are pretty much unsinkable to a high degree, a sort of, outside of catastrophic, total failure. But
Mm-hmm.
they're built for survivability because we learned from the Titanic that if you let compartments fill with water as it spreads, everybody goes down and you wind up with a crappy Leo DiCaprio movie.
Yeah.
So the whole thing that we're moving to now is I mean the whole thing we're moving to
I'm
now is bigger infrastructure, massive compute, massive span and sprawl, and it's if it's done correctly, that thing sails along just fine.
mm-hmm.
You're never going to be, no risk, and you're never going to be no hacks. But the whole thing is, I can take it and I can deal with it and I can move on and recover.
Right, right. Yeah, you can be it's about compartmentalization, which I think historically we've looked at as high maintenance and high overhead, but that's where the
Yeah.
new technology and innovations are helping. At least that was my assessment from, that previous sponsor.
Oh, totally. That's where I mean, micro-segmentation as a approach to doing things was not even doable a few years ago, but now it's pretty commoditized, and there's some companies that do it really well. So I think
Right.
anybody that's still hemming and hawing about we can't micro-segment, you're just not looking at the market because the technical capabilities are there.
Yeah. And it's really about stopping, well, in that sense, it's about stopping spread, right, on the network, but
Yeah, I
also
can deal with.
having, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, like I can deal with a tree on fire in the forest. I can't deal with a forest fire.
Mm-hmm. Because we also used to say, and this is kind of interesting in the context of ransomware, that like when I was pen testing back, I haven't been a pen tester in a long time, but when I was pen testing, we'd be like, look, we can compromise one of your users. Back when I think I don't know where people work today, right? Well, what the split is between remote work and in office work. Just in talking with people, I think there's huge segments that went back to work finally and go to an office. So we'd compromise one of their workstations in the corporate office. And from there, it was a free for all. Then we could spread and move laterally throughout the network. And what my buddy John Strand always said was like, look, like he'd even leveled down like the number one thing that you can do right now. If you're not doing it, like this is a huge security improvement. And that is turn on the firewall for Windows or use your network to isolate your workstations from each other to prevent that lateral movement. Is that kind of what zero trust is enabling us to do more at scale with the manageability?
Well, zero trust at a broad scope is the strategy side around like kind of what you're talking about of the smart application of controls to remove trust from inside of
Yeah.
systems, especially
Yep.
with default relationships, right? Because that's usually a real problem. The ZTX, which is the framework I created at Forrester, breaks zero trust down into the components that you use to do ZT. And to your point, if you kind of think about the market and you think about the capabilities, well, if I take care of my network, great. I can segment my network, but what's the next thing I should take care of? It's probably like users. Okay, well, how do
Hmm.
I isolate and segment users? And that can be a variety of ways. And then, well, if I'm doing that, what do I do about my workloads in the cloud? And then how do I apply this? So the whole goal is to evolve your overall approach to the problem in a zero trust approach and get it where it takes care of everything. And you don't do it, right out of the bag. You do it over time. It takes requirements. Like I remind people all the time in workshops, you spent 30 years building this infrastructure and this network. It's going to take you time to go ZT. Like it's
Hmm.
not, there's no easy button.
But I feel like it can, for ransomware and those style breaches, really limit the damage and the scope, which is something we've always talked about, right? I think we used to use the term limit the blast radius. I don't know, some
Hmm.
people might still use that term.
Yep.
But it seems like this is the culmination of a lot of those different, very tactical individual recommendations, but in a larger strategy of zero
Totally.
trust.
Absolutely. You just nailed it. I mean, and you mentioned the lateral movement stuff when I was red team, and my favorite thing was printers. Nobody ever paid
I was going to go there next, right? And
Nobody
gets
ever cared about printers, but man, printers are tucked in the network and they're pretty smart and you can get all kinds of stuff. I made bank off of ripping people through their printers.
it's great, but and I feel like that's where attackers are leaning towards now. I feel
Yeah.
like we're kind of on this cusp, right? Maybe we've been past it in some, cross the chasm, if you will, in certain aspects of this, where attackers are like, well, it's kind of, I mean, props to us as defenders. It's kind of hard to compromise an enterprise network today, maybe through phishing, maybe getting code execution on a Windows system. Certainly, it's much harder than it was before, right? Like there's EDR has gotten better. Microsoft's in operating system technology has gotten better. I think defender teams in general have gotten better and they've raised the bar. So attackers do, Chase, what you and I do that in pen tests. We're like, oh, well, if that's harder, what's easier? Oh, going after a printer, an IoT device, a network appliance. It turns out, if you read the latest like breach reports and such, vulnerability exploitation is up. I think tied back to these appliances that I call like the dusty corners that no one's paying attention to.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because to your point, like we've seen the trends indicate that the enterprises and the big governments have done a better job of becoming harder targets. And like you said, we know this. If you're the lion on the Serengeti, you go look for the slow gazelle. The slow
Yeah.
gazelle is going to be your vendors, your third parties, your partners, your mom and pop shops, because they don't have time for this stuff and they don't know what they're doing anyway. So that's
Hmm.
why if you look at like MGM and some of these other big breaches that have happened, it wasn't their corporate infrastructure that was targeted. It was their partners and vendors and third parties, and they worked their way to go forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just what attackers are doing. And but zero trust can help in this context because why should an attacker be able to pivot through these systems, right?
Correct. Yep. And why should somebody that's doing admin work have access to things that they don't need access to? Those types of deals, or the other side, if you create a policy that says we do multi-factor auth, well, obviously, if one of your users is getting bombed with 1,000 requests an hour, that's not a human doing it. So block that account. Those types of things. And then
Mm,
it's also one of those deals of I would rather have someone request an exemption and deal with that than them breaking my entire network because I allowed it to happen.
yeah, I agree. It is more maintenance and upkeep, but it's certainly helpful in the resiliency department.
Well, I think it's more maintenance and upkeep to begin with, but now with the
Hmm.
way policy engines work and with all this sort of MLAI stuff, you're able to do stuff at speed and scale with less kind of work. And most of these systems now from the vendors have got learning modes. You let the learning mode
Right.
run, figure out what's going on, and then apply rules. It's not that hard.
Mm, for sure. Um, so you just wrote a book on breaches. Is that you? How many books have you written? You say this is the 12th or
So
11th?
yeah, 11. Where 12 comes out at the end of July, right before Black Hat.
Nice. So what's number? Well, what have the books been about previous to
Uh,
number 12?
so
All
I
over the
did.
map.
Yeah, so I did with my partner Heather. We did we did three comic books for kids on cyber for the Sinja series.
Nice.
Then I wrote two fiction books that are part of a series about AI and cyber warfare, and I've written some nonfiction books about cyber warfare, and
Hmm.
then contributed to a few more. Worked with General Toohill on a book called Riptide that was about manipulating the GPS system, and then finally the last one was the one I just published called By the Breach, where I basically put out a methodology that's proven with data that says here's a way to make money in the stock market when companies continually get breached, and it works. So if you want to make
Hmm.
money, go buy that book.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, let's talk about cyber warfare is an interesting topic, and it's interesting how much of a storied history there is in the topic of cyber warfare.
Mm.
When I read the was it Dick Clark?
Fifth
Who was
Domain.
Fifth Domain? Yeah, that book, and that book traces the cyber warfare conversation like all the way back to Reagan's administration here in the U.S.
Yep.
And you've got several others writing books about that. And Marcus Random was famous for speaking on the topic of cyber, like basically debunking it. Right? Where do we stand today in terms of? It's interesting with the
I mean,
Iran conflict. How
well,
I can actually have intelligent things to say about what's happening in the world because, I'm like, did you know about Stuxnet? People are like, no, what's that? I'm like, well, turns out the Iranian nuclear program has been in our crosshairs for a long time. I'm like, one of our takes at that was a computer virus. And they're like, people who don't work in our industry are like, what? I had no idea.
yeah, I mean it's I remind people all the time, like I think what you're seeing that's been going on in Ukraine and in Iran and Israel is the future state of warfare and conflict, cyber side, and to some degree kinetic conflict too. And what's really interesting to me is if you look at what's gone on with Iran and Israel recently, one of the first things that happened was a big disinformation campaign where they took over the TVs in Iran and started broadcasting stuff about, here's how you can revolt and rise up and whatever. And
Oh,
then
interesting. I didn't know that the cybersecurity was part of the propaganda
yeah,
in
it's
in that
disinformation. Using
disinformation
using
campaign.
that
Right.
medium to do that, and then the follow on to that, like the same day, they took down the Iranian crypto exchange, which was like $100 million worth of money, and for
Hmm.
Iran, $100 million worth of crypto money is a significant. So it's been this cascading sort of cyber attack thing, and then on top of that, you've got the use of drones, you've got
Right.
the use of social media, and they're hacking cameras back and forth between Iran and Israel to vector in on targets.
Yep.
So
Yep. But
this
they
is,
also did they take out their missile defense system in a cyber attack before the recent bombings?
I believe that they did some disruption, but I believe that they were able to keep things up manually because the military, you've
Okay.
always got to fall back. But the stuff that they were able to do where they were manipulating messaging and going forward from there was really interesting to see.
Yeah. But the CCTV camera or just regular cameras is an interesting one. There was it Bit Defender? Not Bit Defender, Bit Site published a report about exposed cameras on the internet. And they were like, I mean, they're not telling us anything new. We know there's tons of, I mean, those like one of the first things we did on the internet once we learned how to Google dork
Yeah.
was go find the exposed cameras. And we're like, oh, like, hey, look, a parking lot. Like, isn't that
Isn't that
interesting?
cool? Oh, I can move the camera.
Yeah. But like, there's still tens of thousands of cameras exposed to the internet, just the ones exposed to the internet today, let alone one in cyber operations from a nation state that they can discover and compromise and use that. So, but they're being used in warfare. That was one of the things the report kind of mentioned was attackers, whether it's from a nation state as a physical attack or just a criminal, can use that to collect intelligence to then launch their attacks. But what you're saying is this is happening in the real world.
Yeah, I was reading a report this morning actually when the dogs woke me up at 4 a.m. because that's just how those little jerks are. But
Mm.
there was a proof basically that Iran launched, I think it was like eight ballistic missiles, and seven of them got hit by the Iron Dome, but one got through. And immediately, the area that it got through, all of a sudden, these cameras went down and came back up, and feeds weren't going anywhere. So they were going to Iran. And what they were doing was basically using those localized CCTV feeds to get a battle damage assessment of that one ballistic missile that got through.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy because that's like on the ground footage. That's, when I was military, we would have killed to have that type of information.
Yeah.
Now you just log in and go look.
Yeah. And the camera systems, I mean, is it the same thing in this context of in warfare, the same context of the cameras that we know and usually don't love that are just riddled with vulnerabilities? I mean, we've
Oh,
seen
that's
so
ring
much research.
cameras and yeah, ring cameras and those types of things that they're just out there and they're misconfigured or somebody buys them from Lowe's or whatever the Israeli version of Lowe's is, and then they just go plug it in and never change the default password or put a firewall on it, and it's out there talking to the internet. And if you're know what you're doing, it's not hard to go find them.
Yeah. Also, vulnerabilities on these cameras are not hard to come by
They're
either.
not smart devices, they're stupid devices.
No.
Nah.
I mean, it's, because we do a lot of firmware hacking here at Eclipsium, right? And I've always been enamored, I should say, with firmware. And you get a camera and you look at the firmware and it's like, oh, wow, there's a lot of vulnerabilities on there. Like, it's really old software. There's no memory protections. It's all the things that an attacker would love to see on a system that they can compromise. But being used strategically in cyber warfare, I think, is something we always theorized about, but now it's happening in practice.
Well, and that's the same thing with the drones. Like most drones are just little flying web servers. And I mean, it's not hard at all to pop a web
Hmm.
server and get it to do God knows what you want. So we've seen that in Ukraine, commercialization of drones where they're using them for all kinds of different purposes. And that to me is, what the future state of warfare and conflict looks like, because cyber is the bridge between espionage and kinetic war. And the longer you can walk across that bridge, the better off because your casualties are lower, but your
Yep.
impact is exponentially higher.
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about drones and cameras, the denial of service vulnerabilities and attacks come into play. Where most of the time I feel like for denial of service vulnerabilities, we're like, whatever.
Yeah.
Like they can you do other ways to, perform a denial of service. They can just send us a whole bunch of packets and have the same result. So we tend to not pay attention to them. But when we talk about equipment that's being used in a warfare conflict, it has to be hardened against for scenarios that we would normally harden our gear for as consumers or even in the enterprise typically.
Yeah, I mean these types of drones and these other types of applications and sort of embedded IoT OT technologies, like people are not giving them enough credit for the potential other avenues that they can be used for. And that's the thing that I think you and I get, right? Because we play in this space, is that anything you build, someone can use for a purpose beyond what it was intended.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the rest of the population of the planet, if they buy a web-enabled camera for their front door, for them it's a web-enabled camera for the front door. They never think about, oh, that's a potential surveillance device.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Miko Hipponen just made the move to an anti. Did you see that? He works for an
Yeah,
anti. He left with Secure and is working for an
he's an
anti-drone.
anti-drone place now, right?
Yeah, anti-drone company, which is super interesting.
Well, I mean, drones scare the hell out of me because there's nothing to really do to, keep those things out of the sky and whatever. And I've been involved in some working groups here in DC where we've submitted mass casualty scenarios based on drones to
Yeah,
congressional folks.
because I think we think of it as just one drone, but what we're actually seeing today is thousands of drones being deployed to areas.
And there's drones that do, there's agricultural drones right now that can carry 50 gallons of, stuff that they spray on top of plants. That 50 gallons of stuff that you're spraying on top of plants, it's like 150, 200 pounds worth of weight. That
Hmm.
could also just as easily be chemicals that you spray on, people to do bad things. So,
Right.
these types of things have to be considered, and people have to think outside the box of just what they're there for. You have to be maybe it's a personality flaw I have, but I mean, you have to be malicious in your thinking a bit.
Mm. So what do we do about the drone threat? Well, how much is a drone threat? I mean, outside of warfare.
Drone threats scare the hell out of me. Like that's one reason why my family, like I don't go to sporting events. I don't go to anywhere where there's a uncovered roof on the place, stuff like that. Because I just, the paranoia in me for a mass casualty event and the fact that there are no controls to stop it,
Yeah.
other than maybe a lucky cop with a 12 gauge,
Yeah, but
scare the hell out of me.
if there's thousands, I always thought that too. But and that was like a joke and a meme on the internet for a while, people taking down drones with shotguns, sure. But
What
if
if there's
there's
250 of them?
hundreds, thousands, yeah, what are you going to do?
Well, and that's, and you combine that with kind of the world that we face today, where we do have, it's FBI reporting instead that there's sleeper cells here in the US and there's militias and
Hmm.
things like that. It just takes one person with bad intentions and enough time on their hands to do bad things. So, there's no controls for it. There is no real defense currently that stands. And all you're doing is really hoping that someone never decides to do this stuff. And that hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, there was a company I interviewed a long time ago, and they were called RF Spotter,
Mhm.
and they used RF for physical security controls, and they could tell the difference between a bird and a drone. If you, I think the thing is you got to get ahead of it. Like once it flies over the stadium in your
Too late.
example, Chase, right, it's too late. But if you can get ahead of it, certainly that signature. I mean, especially today with the technology we had, even the technology we difference between back then and today. I was probably 10 years ago. I did the interview has advanced significantly. Where telling the difference between a bird and a drone is pretty straightforward, right?
So
Um,
what's weird though is the frequency issues that they use for control and for streaming actually typically run very similar frequencies to what people use for 5G and cell phones and those types of things.
yeah,
So your only option is to jam the drone, but if you jam the drone, you
you're
jam everybody
jamming.
else's phones and stuff, and that's a
Yeah.
non-starter at a public event. So,
This was using RF like radar basically to
but that's
detect
real
it.
expensive, so
So
there's
yeah, they weren't, this was like a one-off interview I did. I'm like like enterprise security teams are probably not going to adopt your technology like they're selling to the government and military obviously. But I'm like it's interesting tech and this was just for detection, like detecting a person on the perimeter. It could do that really well just by basically using RF like radar.
Yeah, and I mean I think maybe it was the Dutch or somebody that had the idea they were going to train eagles to take drones down. And it was
Oh
like,
wow.
okay, cool. How many how
That's
many
thinking out of the
how many
box.
eagles do you have? Yeah,
Right. Yeah, and then jamming is hard, like you said, because of the collateral damage to jamming.
and it's expensive and it requires a power source and those. I mean,
Hmm.
we jam stuff in the Navy all the time. Like we live and breathe on jamming people, but that's when we had a giant radar and basically an unlimited power supply. So trying to do
Yeah,
that. Try and do that at the Super Bowl with 100,000 people in attendance and watch what happens.
yeah, because you're gonna jam at everything. Like you said, the frequencies in common are gonna get jammed.
Yep. And if you do that for people that are paying to see the event, you better be ready for the fallout.
Right, right.
And
Um,
most of these facilities would rather accept the risk of not doing that than basically the risk of, well, what if 20,000 people die because we have a mass casualty event?
yeah, it's a tricky situation, for sure. I'm interested to see what Miko is going to publish in the future too, right? Because I mean, the drones are basically IoT devices that fly. So firmware is certainly in play, but
Sure.
again, you have to be strategic about your supply chain attack, about your other cyber attacks against those devices.
Well, and then the other sort of side of it is like if your defense is going to be counter RF or counter wavelength or whatever else, what do you also wind up doing? Because it's not like those jamming things stop at the actual drone. If you're in an area that's downtown, aircraft fly over you. What
Yep.
are you gonna jam the aircraft? Like that's not going to happen. So,
Yeah.
it's a very tricky situation.
How else is cyber war? I feel like we don't use the term cyber war so much
It
anymore. I think
scares
it'd be like,
people.
but yeah, because like the historical thinking was, we're not going to fight in the real world. We're just going to do cyber war, and we're just going to do cyber activities. But what really I believe ended up happening is we're just combining them. It's another, it's another domain, right?
Yeah, it's the fifth domain. I mean,
Mm.
that's why Cyber Command was established, but it's the cyber side, that's why I say it's the bridge between espionage and kinetic conflict. And what we're really getting at there is the longer that I can extend the espionage slash soft impact side of the equation, the better off we are. In a perfect world in combat, you win without ever firing a shot, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do, and that's what we're seeing with these cyber attacks inside of these spaces where you've got massive misinformation, disinformation campaigns. You've got banks going down. You've got hospitals that are targeted. And the point is to cause enough chaos that the side that you're in conflict with can't keep up with everything else. Because,
Yeah.
on the far side of that, if you're the defender, you're the defending nation, you sit there going, well, wait a minute, like priority wise, my citizens are under attack from their banking system, from the healthcare system failing, etc. Do I write off my citizenship and say, look, we can't deal with you right now because we're potentially going to be attacked kinetically? How does that play out? And
Hmm.
then the other side just keeps ratcheting up the heat. So, you can boil the frog here, and it's very good. This is the only space that I've been able to find in my research where in kind of all of history that a nation state like North Korea that's so poor it can't feed its people can build a nuclear weapons program based off of Bitcoin mining. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Right.
Just crazy when you really think about it.
There was some saying that the North Koreans have gotten much better at cyber operations. Right. It was a
Well, they
three
run
buddy
it all in
problem.
China, so
I don't know if you're listening to the Three Buddy Problem podcast, right? They were talking about that.
mm.
So that's where Miko made his appearance as well. I should give them credit. Yeah, but they were definitely talking about this exact topic, right?
Yeah. So I mean, cyber warfare. Like I wrote my book on it a while ago, and I wrote about deep fakes back when nobody was really talking about deep fakes, and now you're seeing that stuff all over the place, and that combines into the realm of cyber warfare because you're doing misinformation, disinformation, causing doubt, those things. So it's like there's this perfect sort of storm lining up, and everybody's looking at Iran and Israel and Ukraine and Russia right now and going, "Gosh, that's crazy." We're not any different.
No,
We're
it's kind of scary, right? Like propaganda wise, we'll start there before we delve into like what we deem as our infrastructure, which is really everything at this point, right? In this context. But the propaganda is interesting. We saw that in the 2020 elections. And we still see that on the internet today. Like, how difficult is it today to figure out if something on the internet is real? Like, the cybersecurity professional and hacker in us is like, well, everything's fake until I can validate it some way. But not everyone thinks that way, which is why these propaganda campaigns on the internet are highly effective.
Well, the algorithms feed that too. Like the goal of the
Yep.
algorithms in a lot of these social media channels is to keep you in an echo chamber, and that echo chamber just gets really, really loud. And if you're able to get stuff that looks valid and moves forward, then people make decisions based on it. I read somewhere recently that there was a study done. I want to say it was by UC Berkeley or something that the human attention span has now basically devolved between 7 and 10 seconds.
Yeah.
So if you can get someone to pay attention to something for 7 to 10 seconds, you have an opportunity to put, call it an implant in front of them that they'll act on.
Right. It's crazy. I was just, it's funny. My friend sent me something, and it was these inflatable boats, but the inflatable boats look like yachts. They had all these people on these, huge inflatable yachts. My friend lives on a lake, and he's like, "Oh, I really want one of these." I'm like, "I hate to burst your bubble." I'm like, "But that was
That ain't
AI.
real.
They're not real. Dude. They're not real,
No.
right?" This is the problem we're gonna have is differentiating, the real from the fake, and things
Well,
like that. And this was just a benign example, but what if it's
yeah,
not?
I mean the skill that this stuff requires to be good at it is so low now. I mean, it's
Yes,
democratization of technology is awesome. Like I want every person on the planet to benefit from it. However, every person on the planet also now has the opportunity to be a malicious actor, and I would argue that they could probably operate at the level of a small nation state if they really felt like it.
yeah, and it's also scary to think about our infrastructure. I mean, across the world, but here in the U.S.,
Oh,
like
it's bad.
what is our critical? Yeah, but like I agree. Well, what is our critical infrastructure? And what we're seeing now is huge botnets being built based on commodity hardware thrown around out there. And to me, that's a potential, disruptor. There's been a couple of examples. There was one big ISP that had a massive outage, and they didn't tie it back to a threat actor. But I was like, what if it was? because all of this gear is, largely firmware based and Swiss cheese, like with our camera example. And our enemy nation states, I think, are, embedding themselves in this technology and are going to use it at some point strategically, as we kind of pointed out in cyber warfare today, that happens.
Yeah, I think what stands out to me is that there's the nation states that are playing the long game, right? So China's basically said by 2050 it plans to be the global superpower, which I would suggest it probably is close to that now.
Hmm.
But ultimately, how do you get to be the global superpower? Well, sooner or later, you've got to do something to exert control across the ocean. We're lucky in the US because we're kind of a giant island, if you think about it, surrounded by either, Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. But the ability for an organization at the level of a China or a Russia, not so much Russia anymore because Ukraine has basically bankrupted them, but more
Yeah.
China to reach across that border and do things that they need to do to degrade the infrastructure, the efficacy, the operations, the monetary side, the economic side of the US is very, very real. And we have this, I go to Capitol Hill once a month and talk to people up there. Those
Hmm.
folks up there are pretty obtuse to this reality. They're just kind of dealing with what we can deal with right now. And when your adversary is playing 3D chess and you're chewing on the checkerboard, it ain't a good thing.
I agree. We need to be more strategic and forward thinking with our defense of our critical infrastructure. And we have pockets of it, but we're nowhere close to securing or in making, that more resilient in any capacity, which is kind of frightening.
Well, and it's also maddening when you think about the fact that we've set up agencies and dumped billions of taxpayer dollars into fixing that specific problem, and we're no better off now than we were 10 years ago when those agencies were established.
Right. We've had some wins, but not on a nation level to specifically address nation state cyber threats, right? I think a
Yeah.
great example is the FDA in approval of medical devices, which is great. I mean, awesome work. Josh Corman and company, right, were instrumental in getting those bills passed. But we need that kind of control and the stick that legislation has, but for all of our critical infrastructure, right? Especially in these super vulnerable devices that we just put willy nilly on the internet, and the internet is filled with them now.
Yeah. I mean, what was the stat? It was like there's two devices for every one person, out there, three devices or something like that. And then, I mean, the numbers just get really big really fast. And this control and large numbers don't typically go well together.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And because we have the legacy problem too. A lot of it is legacy tech. We look at our, like, what most people would term critical infrastructure, power, water, sewer, gas, those kind of things, right? There's so much technical debt to overcome.
Those things have been there since the 60s, 70s, 50s in some cases.
Yeah.
You're talking about like COBOL and Fortran and, old stuff.
Yeah. 100%. Um, let's talk about breaches. Breaches happen all the time. It's kind of funny, Chase. One of my hosts, Jeff Mann, on my Paul Security Weekly podcast, has his list of breaches every week, which is, I mean, it's astonishing. I think some of that is reporting. Some of that is people have better observability of their own networks to determine if they're breached. But also the other side of that coin is, if the breach was ransomware, you're going to know you're breached because you're under a ransomware, right? So
Because your
you
machine's
know.
locked up. Yeah.
Yeah. So therefore, we've got all these breaches to deal with. How do we get a handle on these breaches? And what was the kind of gist of the book?
So the book I wrote was called By the Breach, and the reason I wrote By the Breach was I don't know, at a fundamental, I mean, I grew up on a farm. Like, at a fundamental level, I have a problem with big people making big money off of everybody else, even though they're the ones
Sure.
putting us in a place of failure. So I did a bunch of analysis and looked at stock market stuff. I looked at impact. I looked at social sentiment, and then I basically kind of came out with a calculation that says when a breach occurs, and you can look at the SEC 8K database, the Edgar
Hmm.
database, to tell you when that happens. There's a sweet spot where the stock will dip. And if you buy it at the dip, mathematically speaking, it will recover over time to a degree that's higher than the dip anyway. So you'll make money on the far end. And if you do that, for the many, many breaches that we have,
Hmm.
you can make a pretty significant chunk of change. And
Wow.
I
So like where are you docking your yacht today, Chase?
eventually maybe you'll get there, but it was funny because I when I was doing the research for the book, I plotted everything out on some graphs, and I looked at the graphs and I was like, there's I was like, my math is wrong. Something in here doesn't work because these are all
Right.
so formulaic. And then I redid everything and I came back, I was like, no, it's just that clear. Like it
Right.
just burt, 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 and there you go. Like it doesn't require a bunch of change and whatever. And it also shows that the market is kind of immune to the fear of breaches. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, you got breached. All right, momentary blip, come back.
Yeah, and I think we've all kind of known that, right? There's been others that have, analyzed that data in smaller pockets, right? And it's always been the thing, like, yeah, when they're breached, it takes a dip, and then it comes back.
So it's
And
like, why shouldn't you buy that and make some money?
right, right. But what are we doing wrong that's the norm now? Like breaches are just the norm. Like I feel like there's so is there more, maybe there is more than before, but
Well,
there's
there's
certainly a
more
lot
than
of breaches
before.
today. And
Yeah, the numbers indicate that it's getting worse instead of better. I think I think the stick thing has gotten so out of control that it's almost pointless. I've worked with a group here in DC, and we submitted a write up to some folks on the Hill about a cyber tax credit, and I think that that probably speaks really more to where people would be willing to go. And the whole idea there was you've got CISA, give CISA the authority it needs to scan the internet, which it doesn't have today. And if an organization can prove to you that they are compliant, that they are relatively secure, that they've done best practices, give them a tax credit at the end of the year, just like we do with LEED certified buildings and those types of things. And
yeah,
I think if we did that, we would have a way better return on that investment because everybody loves tax credits.
well,
Nobody.
yeah, it's how we tried to help the environment.
Mhm.
Anytime you get a hot water I think it's similar to like you get a hot water heater or windows or whatever, and it comes with the Energy Star certification, and you get a
Correct.
tax credit at the end of the year for that to help improve the environment because there was no way we were solving that problem without some kind of incentivization program.
Totally. And that's exactly the method that we put together here was to say, like, look, if you're a company and you give us your IP addresses and those types of things, and we run a scan and we don't find anything overt, great, we'll give you the tax credit. Or if we do find things overt, we'll give you 180 days to fix it. And when you prove that it's fixed, we'll give you the tax credit. And
Yeah,
I think if we put that stuff in place, people would be more willing to move around to it. And honestly, that would enable the agencies that we have in place, like CISA and others, to have a an avenue to actually be, I wouldn't say more valuable, but to be more directly impactful to the current state of the infrastructure.
sure.
Because now, like CISA shows up if something bad happens, which I grit it, and they're great people doing great work, but I would rather it be scan, figure out what's wrong, tell me how to fix it, give me a tax credit, and verify and validate.
I love that. I've had similar ideas, Chase, on the consumer side, right? Because we've got so much consumer gear exposed to the internet. And let's even just talk about like routers that are exposed to the internet. Well, if you've got one of these routers, specifically the ones that are end of life, that aren't getting any new patches or updates from the manufacturer, and many of those now have known vulnerabilities. And if it's old enough and they don't have a known vulnerability, I can tell you firsthand that finding one is not all that difficult. Right?
One showed me.
Especially now that we've got all the like people have published a lot of data about that. And you could easily, train. Well, that's actually a good idea. You could train an LLM model based on what has been published and apply that to ones that we don't know that there are exploits for, and probably find a whole bunch more. Now I'm giving attackers ideas. Like, don't do that if you're an attacker. So we could find and exploit these devices easily today with the given technology. But what I love is the incentive program for consumers. And so I call this, and I talked about this on a couple of podcasts. It's Paul's great like incentive program to fix IoT security. And so what you do is you give the ISPs some money to run a program that says, hey, you can buy these new routers at a discount or it's free for you. All you got to do is replace your router, right? Or maybe the ISP goes out and replaces the router for you if you have non-technical people that don't know how to do that, but have this super vulnerable device hanging on the internet. And to me, that positive incentive type program works best in my mind because for the life of me, I wrote a book about routers in 2007 and have been thinking about this problem since then. I can't come up with a better solution than you just need positive incentives for people.
Yeah, because the stick doesn't work. And I mean, even if you
Mm,
look at the insurance to boondoggle around it, and you look at the HIPAA and high trust and PII and whatever, that's just the cost of doing business now. Like people
yeah,
literally just they they
100%.
they, they budget for it, so who cares?
Right.
Whereas
Well,
if
most
you
of the compliance is about, I mean, PCI is about data security, and many of the other compliance standards are more about data security than anything else, which, I mean, I think PCI has done a great job of improving data security around credit cards. I think
sure,
it shaped the whole threat landscape. If we go back and look at it now, right, attackers are doing different things other than stealing credit cards because it's hard to come by credit cards because we protected the data.
yeah. So I mean, and I think the moment you come back and you say, look at the national level, we have a tax credit for this thing. Watch people rush to it. And I mean,
Yeah.
if you're a mom and pop shop, if I give you a tax credit that improves your margins by 3%, that's a grandkid going to college potentially. So
Right.
let's do it.
How was that the reception of that on the Hill?
Oh, they were all about it. They thought it was great. We wrote up like five or six things and whatever, and then we basically said, "Cool, can we get in front of one of the subcommittees and brief and whatever?" And then a bunch of other congressional shenanigans happened, and then it falls by the wayside. And then we've got.
It's hard, dude. Politics is hard, right? It is.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, whenever you guys are ready, let me know. And I mean, they're doing what they can with what they have, but it's one of these deals of, I mean, the folks that we talked to literally campaigned on making America more secure and safe, whatever. And I was myself and the group I was with, we were like, you're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. You have a couple of podcasts of your own. What are you working on? You said you're independent, right?
Yeah, I'm just a contractor. I've got my podcast, which is the Dr. Zero Trust Show. It's on Spotify. And then yeah, I do a lot of pro bono work, helping folks set up infrastructure where I can. I recently did the old folks home that my dad's at because Lord knows they need it. They get scammed more than anybody else. Um,
Nice.
yeah, so I it sounds kind of hokey, but I just at my core, I think that there's a fundamental human right that if we're going to be online, we have the right to be safe and secure. So help where you can.
It is about safety, right? I think some of the best initiatives focus on the safety aspect. It's hard to apply to cybersecurity though. We've talked about it for years on the show. We've talked about automobile safety as an example. We've talked about fire safety. We've talked about like across the board safety in electronics with UL. My example is always like when you buy a TV, there's some reasonable assurance that once you hang it on the wall in your home, it's not going to catch fire. And that's not because, of anything other than there's regulations that you need to pass to make sure that you're reducing the chances that something's going to malfunction and catch fire in the home. So,
Well, and I mean, it's this none of this stuff, to be perfectly frank, typically is exceptionally difficult, and that's probably something that people don't understand is a rising tide in security does not lift all ships. This is about taking care of you and yours and whatever that you and yours might be. But if I do things that are just a little bit better and a little bit safer than you down the street, I'll be okay and you won't because they'll go for the easier target. And
mm,
that is a mindset that you can have here. I mean, I tell my kids when they go out, like my daughters are 16 and 14, I tell them when they go out, they'll say it back to you. I say, "What do you want to be?" And they go, "Hard target." And all I
yep,
mean for them is be aware, like know what's going on, get your head out of your phone. I don't want your ear pods in because you're not listening to what's going on around you. Just be a little bit better than the next easy target, and life is okay.
yeah. And it's interesting you say that, Chase. When I've talked to my pen tester friends about the hardest targets, I'm like, look, we could talk. You get people who've been doing pen testing for 20 years. We could talk all day long about the success that you've had as a penetration tester, the defenses that you've breached. And don't get me wrong, that's interesting, and we should talk about that so that we can learn from it, not make the same mistakes, right? But I think the better question is, what to a pen tester? What's the hardest target that you've encountered in your 20-year career? And you ask multiple people that, and you're like, all right, what in common do those answers have? And I've done this not very scientifically, right? But I've done this, and it comes back to what you were saying, Chase. It comes back to the hardest organizations are the ones that work well together as a team. They're hyper aware, and they're able to, like the OODA loop, for as an example of process, they're able to do that really well,
Mhm.
right? And they're like, it's not really technology. A lot of it is teamwork and awareness. about what you had, and that's what you're instilling on your family, which is it's a great lesson.
Well, and I think too, like, accepting that people are people, and this is where technology can do better than humans. Like, we're in a world now where I don't understand the logic of people spending big budget to try and train people out of not being hacked. Whereas,
Yeah.
like, look, I can put tech in front of you that will stop this. You want me to stop ransomware? Great. I'm going to basically turn off PowerShell because you don't need it. There you go. I just
Hmm.
killed ransomware for you. If you're going to be on the internet, I'm going to put browser isolation in front of you, so you can't click on shit that'll get you infected, like stuff like that. So the one of my really good friends, who's a SEAL team guy, he says the best stuff you do is the simplest. And
Yeah,
like, yeah, there you go. Like, that's gates, guards, dogs. Like, that stuff works.
absolutely. Lots of good lessons. Good closing note too. Chase, thank you so much for chewing the fat with me today. It was great. It was a great just discussion. I feel like
Um,
we were just at a bar having drinks, talking about security.
I'm jealous because I don't have a cigar, so I had to watch you light yours, and I'm
I
like,
know, I know.
yeah.
I get to smoke cigars on the show and in my studio. I'm lucky. I'm
I,
blessed.
I'm in a rental space. They'd be really pissed if I fired you.
Right. Well, awesome. Chase, how do people find your podcast?
Just go on Spotify and look for Dr. Dr. Zero Trust, and I'll be on there. And then if I can ever help you out online, I'm always on LinkedIn, poking at the market every chance I get. So easy to find.
Awesome. Chase, thanks so much for appearing on Below the Surface.
Thank you, man.
With that, we will conclude this episode. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.